is Loremaster's Arcanum. Vivi, it's 128. 128 Loremaster's Arcanums. Who knew? Thanks for joining us in the chat already. I see Manda. I see Boba. How do we sound, Manda? Patrick, thank you for being with us already. We're still a couple of minutes away from going live. And you should make me read something to you. Why? Why would I read something to you? Soothing and relaxing carnival music.
Very soothing.
All right, we sound
I heard
good.
him take a sip of his drink earlier. It sounded like a commercial.
Yeah, the ice clinked in my glass. Well, it's because my microphone is right next to my mouth, so that's all.
Why am I not signed in? That's bizarre.
So we're going to switch over in a second, but let's go ahead and we're going to play our intro video. This is always fun. And then when we come back, we will introduce our really fun guest tonight. I've been excited about this all week, and we're going to have a good conversation tonight. So here we go. The Blue Box Loremaster's Arcanum intro. Hello. Hey, John. Good to see you in the chat tonight. Hope the kids are feeling better. Hey, Mike. Hey, Greg, good to see you in there as well. Hey, Robert. Rachel. It was very close, John. Tick, we actually thought Tick was dead last night. He got confused on a rule about constitution damage. He thought it changed his actual permadeath hit point stat. And it was touch and go there for a minute. Some of Tick, for the power of his character, has had some of the worst rolls.
I have foreseen your doom.
Is that your voice?
No.
Oh, I was going to say it like in the thing.
I did my best to imitate it.
It was close. Very close.
Thank you.
That was very good.
Thank you. Bill the Master Crafter's amazing arena for the joust. We're looking at there. And our Blue Box Sorcerer. All right, and welcome everyone. Blue Box 128. Tonight we are joined, as always, by my amazing and talented and lovely co-hosts, Robert. You know him as Phantom NJ. You love him as your castle keeper. And we have Vivi, formerly Rizia, formerly Lilith, always in our hearts. Great to have you tonight with us, Vivi. And we have the amazing Dan Cross. Dan, you're going to get to know a lot about him tonight. I am just really getting to know him. Shame on me. He has produced a lot of content. In fact, Dan, one of the things that jumped out to me is that you have your hands in a lot of pies. We'll talk about that tonight. You're doing so many different things. Music, videos, Kickstarters, different gaming systems, artwork. It's a lot. But the most important thing we wanted to start off tonight with, Dan, is what is your favorite kind of llama?
I often get them confused with giraffes, honestly. So
Fair.
I gave the impression I was an expert on llamas, but in fact, I really, other than the obvious size difference, I probably would mistake the two.
Fair enough. So as we get started tonight, we're going to talk about some projects that you have going on. You had a Kickstarter that I think just finished and got fully funded. And it's the second, I believe, edition of your Eldritch RPG. But I guess the best place to start is tell us a little bit about your foray in your initial entree into D&D. How did you get involved with playing fantasy role-playing games in D&D?
Oh, geez. Well, it was 1983, and the friend, say my oldest friend, but I'm older than he is, so I don't know that that's accurate. But I met him in kindergarten.
Oh, wow.
So when I was about 10 years old, he brought out what I think what Earl Otis did one of the earliest artwork pieces on one of those early D&D basic sets.
Right.
And I believe it was that one that he brought out. And of course, like anyone that played that game at that age, I was hooked on it immediately. And I think that was about the time everybody was enjoying Indiana Jones and all that. So I remember my very first character ever had a dumb name, like, Roniak or whatever, and he had a whip. And I think I encountered my first monster ever was like kobolds or something, and my first instinct was to say, "No, wait, I can help you," and died. So
You tried to reason with them.
yeah, not a good idea.
I love it. Yeah, I played that box set as well, and those were some good old the halcyon days of Indiana Jones, Star Wars, OG D&D. All we Gen Xers remember those quite fondly. Vivi has no idea about these things. So your first character was an Indiana Jones character. You tried to execute some diplomacy in failed fashion with kobolds, and somehow that charmed you to this game all the way to this day.
Yes, getting killed by kobolds. That was enchanting.
So then, as you go through the years, hey Jay, good to see you in chat. Sam as well. As you
Say that's. Oh, sorry.
go ahead. No, please, Vivi, please.
Say, that was the first time I've ever heard being killed by kobolds described in that manner. Enchanting.
The fun.
Where to go but up.
yeah, no kidding.
It's so true. I mean, really, those are not supposed to be the monsters that kill you. Those are supposed to be the fodder. They're just like a level above the rats in the cellar of the tavern. But
Level 1 wizards say hello.
yeah, especially with that lovely D4 they had, right?
Well, it may have been some sort of vindictiveness or secret desire to have me killed by my best friend at the time. That might be it, Maybe the stats weren't really representative of kobolds, but like the embodiment of his anger toward me at the time.
And what best friend doesn't harbor vindictive desire to kill your character?
That's exactly why Dan said best friend at the time.
No, he's still around. I got him back when later I would just roll entire boxes of dice and kill them all off at once. And like, oh, I'm sorry, I thought that's how rifts worked.
Oh no? Okay.
So you've obviously become a creator, not just a consumer and player of the games. How early did that start? So, for example, we've joked a lot here on Loremaster's Arcanum. So I've been playing since 1979, 1980 type time frame. Robert's is similar, playing for a long, long time. And we joke about things, the original dice, the original game sets, graph paper. Who among us did not sketch out a dungeon on graph paper? When did you find that desire to create fomenting within you?
I think from the very beginning, if someone has the latent desire within to do that, it's going to ignite that. It gives it a channel for that. And one of the first things I ever said to Gary Gygax when I found out that he was alive and not sequestered away in some ivory tower in another universe was, thank you for giving me an excuse to play with my action figures after the age of 12. And he said he didn't really understand what I meant by that, but I guess he didn't care. I don't know. But yeah, I always was the kid who would just sit in the corner and draw or write short stories, all through elementary school and things like that. And I can think of little else that really encourages that kind of creativity that's also potentially social. I mean, a lot of people go on to write, they're novel writers or whatever, but since like so many, especially players in the 80s, we tended to be those who were on the outside. Mm-hmm. And those friendships that I cultivated typically were through those games. So it was not only the creative expression, but that common interest that just gave me lifelong friendships and everything else. And I'm glad that my creativity has remained within that realm because it keeps me connected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's probably why I haven't written any novels.
Yeah, makes it. Yeah, because that's not very. That's isolating and hard work. I've written a novella, a couple hundred pages. It was grueling work, and yeah, it's not a lot of socialization. I've got a couple follow-up questions to that, but let me pause. Vivi, Rob, anything you wanted to ask or follow up on?
No, I think that's a great point. I think just like you say, we always talk about that and touch on that a lot of times. When we talk in regards to D&D about storytelling and building friendships together, lasting friendships, because of being able to storytell together, which is nice.
Agreed. Yeah, I've mentioned this a couple of times on our stream, but for me, Dan, as I started playing in those early days, and yes, I mean it was I was in Arizona, Phoenix, and then moved to Southern California, and all my friends that were, it was a different crowd. It was not necessarily the super social crowd, but I just loved the creativity and I loved the energy of it, and it captured my imagination from the very beginning. I played up into my mid-20s, and then I stopped playing for like 10 years for a few reasons I've discussed on previous streams. And it wasn't until I had kids. I had my daughter at the time was 7 and my son was 5, or maybe 8 and 6. And I started thinking about all that this game had brought to me in terms of socialization, communication, leadership skills, creativity, a desire to read. Much of my reading and that imaginative experience and vocabulary and things which served me all throughout my life, I believe started with D&D and playing role-playing games. And so I introduced my kids to it. We played for 10, 12 years in different campaigns, and then they encouraged me to start a Twitch stream. So it all came back full circle. But I'm with you. It is more than just a game. I play games, I watch movies, I get tired of them. I've called D&D and role-playing games a source of endless wonder. There is always something new. You don't have to ever get bored of it.
Absolutely. What other game like really rewards somebody for researching ancient history, different philosophies, religions, different everything from math to narrative structure to wanting to learn how to write better, or even learn how to improvise. It's just like the list goes on and on and on. There's nothing like it.
No, exactly. And I think that's so true, because it does incorporate so much more than just one aspect of the psyche and the personality. And that is what I think has made so many people fall in love with it for generations. And that's why some of us who might be prone to saying, yelling, "Get off my lawn," because I've got some gray hair. I don't know why you don't have any gray hair, Daniel. I've got some gray hair here. And I remember a time where it wasn't as cool to play D&D as it is now. And you had to suffer for it. And you had to be able to take the slings and arrows of others and still persist in your pursuit and passion.
Yes, I had to cover my books if I took them into the school.
Yeah, take like how you do sometimes in school. You take like an old paper sack from the grocery store or something and tape it. Just give yourself a nice brown book.
Yes, like, oh, it's nothing. It's just a cookbook, something wholesome.
I love it. All right, so what was the first creative project you remember starting? If you go back, obviously, besides just penciling together a dungeon or the things that we all do in the game, when was the first time you can remember actually creating something in this genre that was of meaning to you?
Of meaning to me? Well, I think that sort of on the broadest level, I would probably guess that I'd share that experience with almost anyone that sat down to GM the first time, or even someone who was just a player and was just a player, who was thinking about their character's background or anything like that. So just the act of playing is going to become that experience. So in that sense, I wouldn't necessarily be able to remember.
Right.
But as far as like non-professionally sitting down to try and come up with something, I think originally I tried to do what a lot of people do. Like, I was fascinated by the early Greyhawk books or the World of Mystara and than reading about Planescape. So those things inspired me to want to create more. So definitely I didn't have what I would consider any kind of ingenious original ideas that burst through and but so many things inspired me over time, like Banestorm, for example, through GURPS. I don't know if you remember that one, but or Torg and those multi-genre things, Palladium's Rifts, all those things, they over time inspired me to think of what to me would be an ideal campaign setting. And I think a lot of GMs do this too. It's synergistic. It's you're taking inspiration from so many different things to create, or in a renewal kind of way, what is become personalized. And I thought, well, I really like the idea too of shared space. Like I can't say I read them all, but like Thieves World series and stuff like that, I've heard that they were like a shared universe in those ideas, which I really liked. The collaborative nature of things. So like the campaign setting that is official for Eldritch on Arave is something that directly comes out of my experience of all of those different games, where it's like the melting pot. Kind of, it's a parallel or the dream world, but basically I wanted to design it so that you could take any world and just drop it in anywhere, because it is manifest of the dreams of humankind,
Right.
throughout all ages. And that's what most game masters do anyway. They make it their own.
Right.
And so my setting is less of like a total separate cosmology with an intricately detailed history of its own. I do have sample regions where a lot of things are explicated for, just to have something to pick up and
Sure.
use. But that is where I really started to, I think, create my first real something that was more uniquely my own, and yet very much designed in the nature of what GMs already do. I don't like to reinvent the wheel necessarily, but I like to have an additive property to it.
You just added rims to the wheel. That's all you did. New rims.
A whole lot, yeah. And I think like I there were some other realms that they had vast stretches of unexplored land for that very purpose, because they knew that was the GMs are going to create their own.
Absolutely. And, that flexibility with the game world, being able to plug it into different concepts, including sort of a multiverse or cosmos, which can work in different manners with your game system, makes it very flexible. And we're going to get into some of the unique points of Eldritch RPG in a few minutes. I did get a chance to, I must confess, I got the 318-page core rulebook from you on Friday. I have not read the whole thing yet. I hope you can still talk to me tonight, but I did get a chance to peruse it, and there's some really interesting concepts in there. Before we get to that, though, coming back to the start, the kind of the genesis of your career in creation, when was the first time you remember doing a project and getting paid?
Oh, yeah. Well, before I answer that, exactly the first thing that comes to mind was I was desperate to get published or something. I wanted that. I wanted that thrill. And when Dragon Magazine was still in circulation and being published, I wrote a short essay that was actually published in their letters at the time. And it was just what not to do is, it was very short bits of advice that I was jotting down as I was playing with someone else who I found myself, unfortunately, rather bored with. Like such a jerk. But anyway, yeah. So they published that, and I thought, oh, look at me! They published my letter. I feel so special. And then I got a letter in the mail from someone who had read that and said it inspired them. And I was like, I don't know, 16, 17 years old. Turns out that guy was in jail.
Oh.
So that was sort of. I was like, well, okay, good. I enriched his life, I guess. So that was interesting. But then I tried to write something more substantive for Dragon Magazine, and that was rejected. And it was that point I kind of realized that, rejected or not, I'm just not going to stop. I can't. So whether I was going to get paid or not, I wasn't too. But the first time I was actually paid for a project was pretty much the first time I worked with Gary.
Well, I was going to ask you about your first experience with Gary, so I guess that's one and the same. Go ahead, tell us about that.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah. So I had found out that he had his own website, which surprised me because, like I said, I thought that he was sequestered around in some other universe. I didn't know. And he was always like a childhood hero to me, watching the D&D cartoon and all that. And so I had written to him and thanked him, like so many, for being a part of creating what was to become this hobby. And I asked him for an autograph, and he said, I'll tell you what, if you send me a carton of unfiltered Camel cigarettes, I'll send you some autographed books. So
Did he really?
yeah, so I went to the convenience store and I bought a carton.
Did he bother validating you were over 18 first? Or?
No.
I wonder how many 12-year-old kids got a similar message and were outside of convenience stores.
This was about
Can you buy me some
1999.
cigarettes?
Yeah.
So I was over 18 by then.
Yeah.
But it was pretty funny. So I sent him that, and sure enough, he sent me 3 autographed books back.
Wow.
It was the Dangerous Journeys books,
Okay.
and that was really cool.
You still have
And
them?
then yeah, oh yeah.
Mhm.
And I don't know when he found the time to write novels.
Yeah.
I've never met anyone so prolific in my life.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you about that in a minute. How it led to the world builder in general. That's another. So much about him is just plain, straight, flat out funny.
Yeah. I've heard that.
He had a great sense of humor. But I continued to talk to him, and he was really generous with his time. I have friends that I love very much who might never answer an email. You know, you expect maybe only your mother to really answer you every time, but he did every time, and he must have gotten thousands of emails. I don't know.
Wow.
I don't know how he did it. He was really engaged with his fans, and so he had told me he was working on a new game, and I was well aware of the irony that he had found himself in, competing with the brand that he had created through TSR. And this game he was designing, originally he was designing it to work on computers. And so his approach to it was very, very different from his last work, which was the Dangerous Journeys game, which was huge. Yeah, that's another story. But he offered to show it to me. And I thought, wow, secret initiate here, sure.
Yeah.
Do I get a decoder ring? Or anything?
Yeah, exactly. Secret handshake?
Yeah.
Gygaxy and Acolyte.
He at one time referred to me as part of his cadre. So
Nice.
That was cool. Yeah.
Wow.
And I devoured that material and Legendary Adventure, which at first it was like, you didn't really misspell Legendary, did you, Gary? And I was like, no, it's copyright. You know, you can't trademark something that's regular spelling. And that game itself was inspiring and instrumental, and it had a lot to do with decisions that I made later when I designed my own system. But while I was working with him, and I wrote a few articles for Legends magazine, things like that, I thought, you know what would be really cool? I said to Gary, I've never known anyone to be so good at just writing lists. You're like this list maniac. And I said, I'd love to see that whole book of just like information and inspiration and brainstorming ideas. And he wrote to me, he was working with Troll Lord by then, and also with Hika Forge, which was the publisher of Legendary Adventure with Chris Clark. And he wrote back to me, he said, oh, yeah, that is a great idea. Why don't you write it? And I thought, well, Gary, I suggested it to you because you're the one that's good at that, right? was like, I don't want to do that. And so I was, biting my nails like, well, this is not what I expected for a first project, because that sounds really arduous. But then a few days later, he wrote back and he had video. The original name of the book was like the books of, facts and things, right? And the idea was based on descriptionary. So if you wanted to build your own city, your own environment, whatever, you just have all of these different descriptors that were very much geared toward that. But he wrote that email back and he said, now look what you've made me do. And he couldn't stop. So I thought, okay, all right, so we can co-author it, right? And for the next year, I just researched all kinds of stuff, especially biomes and tree types and things like that. So lots of excuses to take a walk in the park.
Yeah, absolutely. And we got a couple questions in chat. Amanda, I'm going to save those when we get on that topic. So let's not lose track of those. But also, if you have any questions for him on sort of this time he had with Gary and some of these stories, you can go ahead and pop those in as well. And then we'll come back to these when we get onto Eldritch RPG and start dealing with the game system itself. Tell us a couple of more of your more memorable stories with Gary, things that stuck out to you, or even you mentioned some things to me there, processes that occurred in transition of IP and TSR and things. I mean, you must have been, you got a front row seat dream of a lot of kids at your age. I mean, that was really, really cool how you got into that inner cadre. Tell us some of the more interesting things you saw.
Well, I've only been to Gen Con twice. And both times he was there. That was 2000, 2001. And the first time I went, that was the first time I actually met him in person. And I just felt like a little kid. I guess it'd be like if you're a musician and you meet David Bowie or something. And so I saw he was running a game for a number of people in one of the halls. This was in Wisconsin, so it was long before Gen Con moved to Indianapolis. And I was scared to approach the table, and but I did, of course. And he was very casual and nice and said, hey, just sit down, grab a character sheet. I think it was Legendary Adventure that he was promoting at the time. And he had like the original Greyhawk maps in his hands, like his own sketches.
Oh, wow.
And his original dice set. I was like, oh my God, you're like an avatar of nostalgia right here. And just to see how he would run it, it was interesting too. I mean, it wasn't long or involved, short session games, stuff like that. But
how would you describe? I mean, I don't know if I've ever asked this question of anyone or heard it told. What was Gary like as a DM?
What's the word? The first word that came to my mind, like automatic thought, was sharp. Like he kept the action moving, and like if he described, like in this one scene, we walked into a cave. I remember this was a long time ago, right? But I remember I said, "Oh, I know this trick, right?" And I said, "I look up," and he said, "Is that your action?" I said, "Well, I'm looking up." He said, "That's your action, right?" Like that's how fast. Like that was a fast moving thing,
right?
Oh, geez. Okay, well, looking up is one action. I see.
So did you look up for your action or no?
Yeah, I felt I must well double down on that and look up. Nothing dropped on my head in that case that I can recall.
No kobolds.
Right, yeah. He wasn't so cruel. I'm sure he might have been, actually.
That I think my response would have been,
quickly scratching off the
go ahead, Rob.
lurker above. Quickly scratching off the lurker above.
Yeah, exactly. No, spider web's gone.
He wouldn't have killed me in such an obvious way,
Yeah. Obviously not.
Well, that's fantastic. What else? Anything else you wanted to cover on some of those Gary stories? And Rob and Vivi, anytime you guys can jump in as well.
Yeah, there's one thing that kind of stands out in my mind, and that was how authentic he was and how he didn't give a damn about what people thought of him. And I've heard rumors that maybe he rubbed people the wrong way. It doesn't surprise me at all. But I liked him anyway. And I was on a list server with him when, like, I learned very quickly that he was not like the Isaac Asimov type that I had imagined. He was an actual human being with opinions that differed from my own in many ways, but still fascinating. And he was okay agreeing to disagree too. He just liked to debate, but he also was not interested in being a diplomat. And so I'll never forget when I was in this one room in Gen Con and he was speaking to the audience, and some kid stood up and asked him about the introduction of clerics into the game, and asked him if he did that because he was a religious man. When it came to religion and things like that, he was a very private man. So his response was, "How often do you brush your teeth?" What a rude question.
What a rude question. I love it.
I felt this kid's pain. I felt like I was going to die for that kid. I was like, "Oh my God, Gary, how could you say," right? But he wasn't even really aware of his importance maybe to this kid, right?
Right.
So he invited me later, which was like a highlight of my life. He invited me to talk to him, and I met his son Luke briefly, which so long ago I don't know that Luke would remember that. But I was sitting in the Hilton with him, and I thought, that really disturbed me, and I thought I'll just bring it up.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
And I said, "Hey, Gary, when you said that, I felt like that kid was going to crawl under a rock and die. Like, why?" And he just said, "Oh, really?"
Interesting. Okay. So like you said, maybe just unaware of the impact and what he represented to that kid.
Right. He just didn't take himself seriously enough to think that he could have such an impact sometimes.
Interesting.
He thought of himself as a fellow gamer. He really did. But that sometimes came across in surprising ways, I should say. So, yeah. But he was a pleasure to work with, and funny too when he was, editing. He was the editor of Insidiae, which was a book on how to create plots for role-playing games that I wrote as part of the Gygaxian Fantasy World series. And if he didn't like the part, he'd say, "Well, that's about as useful as chicken shit on a pump handle." And I'd say, "How do you really feel, dude?" Like, I guess I need to change that part.
Yeah, I guess. So you're saying it's not my best work, Gary.
Yeah, he was forthright, and
Yeah.
I loved it.
I love it. Well, I have a bunch more questions on that topic, but I do want to make sure we get to some of the active projects that you're working on. So, you mentioned Gary was prolific, and I think you've attempted to emulate that. I read a quote from Brandon Sanderson. I think it was like 2 days ago, and he was being interviewed about how he got started in writing, and he is known as probably the most prolific fantasy writer today. Guy just churns out so much quality work. And he said, look, I think he said something like 20 books that he had written and submitted and had been rejected on every single one. And he said, I remember the day I sat down and I asked myself, would I be okay if I went the rest of my life and on my last day, I die with 100 unpublished books in my closet, never having made it in terms of publishing them, just writing them. And he said, I decided that I was okay with that, and that's what I wanted to do. And he said that was really the turning point in his career. Just reminded me so much when you talked about how prolific Gary was. Was that inspirational to you in terms of the amount of content that you've been creating throughout your career?
Yes, I would say it wasn't the fact that he produced a lot necessarily that was the inspiration. It was just I could tell that it's something he just would have done his life. That was his passion, or as Joseph Campbell would say, it was following his bliss, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he would have done it anyway. I know that. So in that sense, it was. When I compare myself in terms of like just output, certainly I know Piers Anthony, or or in terms of the role-playing game designers, there's some that are like just machines, like Robert Schwab or whatever, with Demon Lord, and like I don't know how he does it. He must plug himself in at night.
He's actually right here in Murfreesboro. I think he lives in my town. And
Oh, really?
yeah, and I almost had him at Blue Box Con this year, but there was a scheduling conflict, and so I'm gonna hopefully get him on an LMA here pretty soon, and maybe he'll be with us at Blue Box. I run a convention. It's a very small, 50 or so people that are part of our community that come each year. But yeah, he churns out a lot of content.
I'm in awe of designers like that. For me, I've always been very, very picky. And maybe it's kind of like Sanderson said, like if I have 100 unpublished books, which I admit I probably feel a little sad on my deathbed about that. But
yeah, I don't know that I would have that dedication.
Still, I have a master's degree in organizational psychology, and yet I just have continued to almost obsessively pursue Eldritch and other things. And it's not that I wouldn't want to write for D&D, it's just that I like to do things that inspire me and excite me personally, even if that means less output or less opportunity even. So like I saw you flash by one of those books that I had written was for the Black Void RPG.
Oh yes, I saw that. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely fantastic. And it was inspiring as a world and as a concept. So I wanted to write for that. And that's what makes it possible. Because I've read too just experiences of designers, and they become obsessed with a worry that I can relate to, of course, that you want to legitimize your time. You want to show that what you're doing with so much of your time and effort is going to support your lifestyle, or in the case if you have a family, you want to make sure your family's not like, hey, that's great, you have another published book, but do we have to have ramen again?
Yeah, I'm following my bliss.
Right. And sometimes you end up doing that single. But it is where my heart is. I can't give it up. And so as an example, when I published the first edition of Eldritch, this was a huge learning experience. It was after Gary had died, and the license had been pulled for the Gygaxian Fantasy World series from Troll Lord. And I found myself suddenly in a position where everything I had written or had invested myself in was off the shelves. I thought, oh, geez, well, okay, I guess I should just write my own game. And I thought, I know what I want to do. I'll make a basically fantasy heartbreaker of my own. Not that can compete. If anybody would advise you, make something original and different and that would really stand out. Something like, the craze of Vampire the Masquerade, or, but no, not me. No, I really just wanted to do my own fantasy game. But I did it well enough, it seems, that I approached Goodman Games, and he said it seemed remarkably complete, and he took a chance on it and published it.
Wow.
But without a lot of advertising, without a lot of con presence, without constant effort, it's really hard to stay above. And also trying to beat the clock against the 4th edition at that time before it came out. Working for the first time with other layout artists and things like that. When something gets sent to the publisher and it has errors, and you're told that you have a choice between not having it published at all and letting the errors go through.
Ouch.
Things like that.
That's tough.
And I thought, well, you know what? I'm just gonna let it go through and I'll explain. It's like, it's a good game, I think. So those errors will wait for the second printing. I was stunned by the amount of errata in some of these games early on, and I used to be completely intolerant of it. And of course, talk about eating crow, right?
Sure. I mean, that's what keeps it vibrant.
Right. But I chose to keep the IP for the game system.
Sure.
And so when it came time to try and do a campaign setting for it, of course, Joseph Goodman is a wise businessman. He's like, well, I don't own the IP, and so unless sales were to justify it, like I'll consider publishing it if you hand over a finished product. I'm like, okay, well, I get it. I'm keeping the IP. Like,
right.
So eventually that went out of print, and his advice to me was, don't do any more Eldritch. Not because it's not a not because he didn't believe in the game or didn't like it, but because if I wanted to really succeed, that go where the audience is, right? And that's wise. That's wise advice, and I ignored it. So in 2013, I did a Kickstarter for Revised Edition, and with the original co-author of the original system, an old high school friend, put that one out, and continued, and to avoid doing what might have been easier, DM skill and stuff like that, although easier in some respects in that you're competent, especially nowadays. I can't imagine not getting lost in the crowd.
Right.
Did you find it hard, Dan, to make that decision to not go with that advice and continue on with Eldritch? Like, was that a hard decision for you, or was it pretty easy for you to decide?
It's almost like I had two minds about it.
Mm-hmm.
It was hard because I grew up in an area where, like, the worth of a person was the money they made. Like, the kids would come to school in their BMWs, and if they crashed it, their parents would buy them another one. Or, being told, well, if you're a struggling person or you're poor, it's because you're inferior, right? Stuff like that. So these are schemas that are in the head. So that lends a lot of conflict internally to that sort of thing. But then my nature came through. Like, well, okay, I don't care. I'm just going to be me because I can't do anything differently and enjoy it.
Yeah, for sure. Do you feel like Gary Gygax had any sway on that kind of decision making? Because you kind of said previously that he kind of didn't really have that, where like he kind of just was him, and he was just himself, and he just did what he wanted to do. Do you think that kind of had any sway on your decision making?
That's very insightful of you, actually. Yes, it very much did, because I was not a positive thinking person, and I'm not Mary Poppins now, but I definitely was of the negative bent when I met him. And he said, listen, if you please 10% of the people 10% of the time, you are doing great.
Yeah.
And I appreciated that. And I even had discussions with him about, like, even before I had my kids, my daughter's 17 now. But before I had them, I said, I don't know if I want to bring any kids into this world. I just,
oh, wow.
And his exact quote to me was, oh, sure, just let the Cretans spawn while you have something actually to contribute.
That's amazing. I literally had the same conversation with my eldest like 3 months ago. So I feel in such good company now.
Well, then you unwittingly gave him a Gygax.
I did not. I'm going to write that down. I'm going to tell her that. Yes.
And that kind of attitude definitely was infectious, I would say. And he never gave up.
For sure, yeah. So that's awesome that you continued and just kind of stuck with your gut, regardless of,
Yeah, and I think it's going to pay off.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome.
At least in terms of personal satisfaction for that. I met some really great people through that too, like John Crayfield, who wrote the Slayer's Guide to Dragons, and another book on the end. Did a lot of stuff for Legendary with Gary. He's a really good friend of mine over in London. I like to talk to him just because I like his accent.
It's a good reason.
Yeah, and my good friend for now probably close to 20 years, Eric Bergeron from Canada, like especially nowadays where everybody's playing online, which was almost unthinkable.
Right.
To have such diversity and experiences, meeting different people with different talents all over the world is also a great thing. But I worried, but I did it anyway. So that's what it came down to.
Good for you. And Vivi's from Canada, and I note that you did not mention that you like to talk to the person from Canada because of their accent.
I think the first thing that you guys mentioned is when I went to Blue Box 10 last year is when I said bag, apparently, and it was because you guys were talking about the bag of holding, and then I said bag, and everyone's like, what? And I was like, ooh.
At least you're not like Rory and call it a dagger.
A dagger.
Yeah, dagger. Every time, years later, he saw a dagger. I'm like, what's the dagger?
And it becomes suspicious. Where are you from?
Yeah, exactly.
Are you Yeah.
Because I blame Canada for everything.
That's okay.
Sound principle, especially if you have to fight with their shipping. Fight with their shipping a few times, and you'll hate that country. Sorry, Bibby.
That's okay. Don't worry. Rory glitter bombed them, so don't worry about that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. All right, so we got some questions in chat. Let's dive into Eldritch RPG, and a couple of the questions that came up earlier. Let me scroll up here. One was
I have
from.
them here.
Okay, with Vivi, fire away.
Amanda asked, "What was your biggest challenge with this project?"
As a whole, and that the project itself, if I think about Eldritch RPG, was that the biggest challenge was that it was never ending. Part of the disease of tinkering. Now that I'm on a second edition, the biggest challenge I think was probably just what we had discussed, like making the decision to take the time to do it. I had 2 failed Kickstarters for this project of the second edition before I finally funded it this year.
Oh wow!
So as you can see, I really just didn't want to give up.
And when did that close?
Just like a little over a month. Oh, geez, my sense of time is terrible. It's like if you don't sleep, it's all the same day. But recently it closed recently.
Is any reason Alex chose not to tell us about you and get you on the show before then? Do you take late backers?
I was cultivating a sort of a mysterious air.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Well done.
It had to be just like serendipity to find the project and contribute to
Exactly, yes.
I don't know. I blame him entirely. I think it was terrible, and I'm just never going to forgive him.
Rory's question was, "What is the main thread or theme, and how does it manifest?"
Wow, that's a really good question.
It's Rory's question, so I mean on par.
Yeah, on the one hand, I'll give like the cop-out answer, which can sound almost glib. Well, it's whatever theme you want, of course, it's the DM,
Right.
Duh. Right? But that is a cop-out answer. And more generally speaking, I liked the idea, for example, of like 13th Age iconics. I really liked the idea of these centralized areas where you have one major recognizable evil force, or what have you. But I didn't actually structure my sample region, so the Eldritch realms of Madoin, Samorium, and those as such. But I did want them themed culturally in a way that was more similar to Banestorm or Torg. So the main conflict in the realms that are depicted anyway, are between like a society of people that were descended from original Templar knights who were sucked in through a dream storm, which I call a Rever Edge, and they found
I'm sorry, would you call it what? What'd you say it was?
A Rever Edge.
Rever Edge,
like,
okay.
Yeah. On a rave, that's
Okay.
it actually translates to bad dream.
Mm.
So it's not surprising that while a world manifest of dreams will have, of course, nightmares, because without that you wouldn't have much conflict or monster stats, right? So they came through and they built their own society, but they believed that they were still following the monotheistic religion, and I wanted to steer clear of being too close to attempting a depiction of real world religions like Banestorm did. So I fast forwarded several hundred years where, in fact, I remember the old legends of the Templars, that they were accused of being in league with Baphomet, right? Mm-hmm. And anyone who's actually a scholar and knows how to pronounce these things, forgive me. I'll
that one works for me. That's pretty much how I've always said it.
Yeah. In fact, Einar Ave, when I say that, I made up that word by looking up on Google Translator different words I wanted to smash together. And then my artist, Eric Bergeron, who's in Quebec, said, "Well, you're pronouncing it wrong, dude." It's like, "Oh, I'm pronouncing my own word wrong." Okay. Well,
That's artistic license. It's covered.
Yeah, but Baphomet in a world of dreams, that Baphomet's real. So I thought, well, it'd be kind of cool if that demon actually took on the guise of their monotheistic god, and then created this settled land of the Templar Knights, which became named Samorium, and corrupted them. So they made them, a basic xenophobic society. And there was some inspiration for that out of Torg. I think there was like a sort of a twisted Catholic-like nation in that game that was so that served as some inspiration to that. But they are on the other side of a massive forest, enchanted forest called Meath, which has a lot of the mythological creatures that have come in through the collective beliefs of humankind in the different periods that are clashing. So you have Babylonian Perry, you have those versus angels and devils, and that's the thing. They're all within that forest kind of intermixing. And on the other side of the forest, you have Madoin, which is a Celtic nation. And their pantheon is distinctly that, Tuatha De Danann and that sort of thing. And so the main conflicts are between the different pantheons and people and their cultures. And this world, I had hired Peter Schaefer of Wizards of the Coast to help me write it. I love to collaborate. I really prefer to collaborate, actually, because I don't know. I just get lonely if I'm sitting there writing by myself. I need feedback or something.
You mentioned why you don't write novels, right? So
Yes.
Right. I like to collaborate. So I gave him the whole vision, and that when he was done, it occurred to me after it was done that it was missing one thing that was important to me personally, and that was the game that I designed was just so I could play essentially D&D the way I liked to play it with my style, and it's my homebrew essentially. But it lacked what I loved from like Planescape, for example, in the City of Sigil. It lacked that place where all kinds can come together.
the cantina.
Because, right, like on a rave, a settled land is one where the collective belief of those dreams that have formed it have become so concretized or solid that the reality itself is stable. And so you have very distinct cultures, or cultures that were influenced from Earth's past, if they happen to have been founded by actual people of Earth and the crossing over, if not a denizen of the dream world itself that created it. But with such distinct spheres of cultural and deital influence, I thought, well, how does the traditional adventurer from any background, or if my friends want to bring in the tiefling or whatever they want to do, how does that fit? So I came up with Crossroads, which my last name being Cross, it wasn't too far of a stretch to come up with that one. And that was a place which was also inspired by, if you remember, the old Ultima games.
Oh, who doesn't?
Richard Gary.
Beside Vivi.
And they had those neat gates that would open during the equinoxes.
Yes.
And I thought, I loved that concept. So I put one of those gates, tribute to Richard Garriott, right in the middle of Crossroads. And at a certain times it opens and people just come wandering through like, where the hell am I? Right? And that's an easy excuse to bring any character from any world into there.
Right.
Being that Anarave contains all worlds possibly to be dreamed. And then I said, well, everyone loves their Adventurers Guild, and I was a big fan of Bard's Tale and that stuff when I was a kid. Yeah. So I wanted that flavor, I wanted that feel. I wanted the Adventurers Guild, so I put that in there. The Guardians Guild, which I was thinking of, like, if you combined the Harpers with just a bunch of looters, that's the strangeness you get there. But also, because of the gates, it has a little bit of a flavor of like the Sigil too, which is sort of a strange place to put into a world where you have such distinct cultural backgrounds and influences and mythologies that informed them. And so that became more of my focus on that. And the conflict is often between the Guardians Guild and those forces of evil that would destroy the other nations. They become the protectors, principally of Madoin.
So can you talk a bit about some of like the design decisions that went into Eldritch and what inspired them, like the combat system. I noticed it's part passive, part active in terms of like defense and such.
Yes,
Yeah, and
I certainly.
and along with thank you, Rob, because that's exactly where I wanted to go. And some of the other things you reference in there with combat are narrative combat, which I think is an interesting concept. I'm curious what you mean by that, and then also this semantic design all seems to be centered around that. So, put all that together and just kind of tell us about that.
Sure. I had two very different player groups as a teenager or young adult. And one of them, they weren't LARPing, but they darn near did, where they would describe their every move. And several of them were trained in martial arts and boxing and all that kind of stuff. And they were more concerned with what we call it verisimilitude, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they also were used to playing game systems that allowed for at least a feeling of being in control of the action of defense. And so they played Palladium. And they actually had started with Palladium. They'd never played D&D and didn't really want to. And so I was trying to play test an adventure that I was working on, but I was using D&D. I think it was 2nd edition at the time. And they just could not wrap their heads around the fact they didn't get a defense roll. Like the abstract nature of AC just drove them nuts. It made it feel like I was out of control. Or for some reason, the way they played, they would gauge the effectiveness of their strike based on their ability to personally understand that kind of attack form or martial art expertise in their own minds. Whether that was accurate or not, I don't know. They were teenagers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that could be intimidating as a GM. It's like, well, I don't know. I don't have this training. Like, are you expecting me to not roll dice and just judge it based on your personal knowledge? That's kind of interesting. But what happened when I was trying to run D&D for them was they didn't get the fact that if you have 100 hit points, like, you don't have the physical endurance and stamina of 4 war horses. But if they wanted to describe something as actually having hit, because they went into some great elaboration about how their attack form or what they were going to do should necessarily have this particular effect if it was described as successful, which is getting into games that they played too, like GURPS, where you have hit location and very, very specific results, or Rolemaster, you have huge charts.
Rolemaster,
far more random. But you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, it's one of my favorites.
So I thought, like, guys, why don't you? Okay, I tried to explain. Like, just describe if a character hits you, and you have this many hits. Just describe how your character mitigates the harm. Describe how you have avoided physical damage, and I do the same. And a lot of GMs know this. That it's been written about in Dragon Magazine and as far back as I can remember, right? So I don't know how many. Just think of it like I hit, and I have to have physically hit you. But other players, it's just no big deal, right? But for them, I thought, well, how do I like get around this, right? So when I was designing Eldritch, I was thinking of those players in addition to my regular D&D players, because for some it just never would have been an issue in the first place. But I thought I'll just reverse engineer the way it works. So instead of having a 2-hit roll and then a damage roll, I will put the onus on the player to describe how the damage is mitigated, and I'll create like a layer cake where it's the active and then the armor and then the passive, which can also help with determining the effects of poison or other things like that, where it's important to determine that you've actually made physical contact for those purposes. Because I didn't want a complex hit location system, so that was a big part of it. Just very detail-oriented tactical players frustrating me.
So that's the narrative piece of the combat, right?
A big part of it. Because if the player kind of gets the groove of it and understands that when I roll these dice, I call it potential harm. I avoid the term to hit because I'm not trying to roll to attack to see if I hit you. It's assumed that it's going to land unless that character gets out of the way or blocks it somehow. And that is represented by the same old hit points. It's just, there's no need to roll to hit. that speeds up combat considerably.
How so? Because as I'm listening to it, it's fascinating to me, but it would seem like it would slow down combat. So you have two roles. We play a hybridized. It's basically Pathfinder 1E or 3.5 AD&D.
Okay.
But we here at Blue Box, we bring in some first edition rules, and we have the crit tables, which are much more an homage to the Rolemaster style criticals, very, very violent and detailed. But when you have an attack roll and a defense roll and a narrative element, which we'll often add as flavor, and I've even seen I've played in many situations with my game where if I get a narrative from a player, I will apply that as a sort of DM discretion bonus to hit or some other way to implement a mechanic around the narrative. But if this is sort of part and parcel of how combat goes, how does that speed it up?
Well, because there's not as many actions for the player to take as what you may be assuming.
Okay.
For example, in this system, something that was inspired by Legendary Adventure is that the sword can kill as readily as the dagger. And so weapon damages are not a thing. You don't roll weapon damage. It's based entirely on, well, not entirely, but it's largely based on your ability. And so the genesis of the whole system began when I thought, well, I took two four-sided dice and I said, what if each one represented an opponent? And one had 1 to 4 potential points of harm to another, and correspondingly 4 hit points. And that meant they were roughly equal in strength and also in potential attack capacity. So in order to determine the potential harm, I would just roll the d4. The result of that would be subtracted from the hit points of the enemy. That's it. That's the whole system.
Mm-hmm.
It's just when you layer it, you think, oh, that sounds like a lot of bookkeeping, but it's not really, because it can take a while to get through the active defense, first of all, especially if the hit point pools themselves are actually based on the abilities, the maximum value of the dice combined.
Right.
So everything is through the ability system. So if, let's take, for example, if you have the basic attribute of prowess and you add melee to that, and let's say each one is represented by a die 8, because it's kind of like in Savage Worlds, you have the ascending die values. If you roll your 2 die 8, so you get a 16, and then the enemy says, okay, I got 16 points of threat of potential harm coming toward me, and he might have 10 points in active defense. So 6 points would be getting through at that point. So you just subtract it, and I'm pretty terrible at math, but like that was easy enough, mm-hmm. Right? And then another design consideration was something that came up in GURPS. I did not like the fact that damage resistance in GURPS was a number where if you had one enemy facing off against another, he literally could not harm the other no matter what his strike was because the DR was too high. That doesn't happen in D&D. Now, there may be some rules that mitigate.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, if you had there are certain. If you have a damage reduction against a certain weapon type, for example, or you have creatures which are immune to certain weapons, you can. But I get your point.
Right. In general, it may be that my thinking on that was GURPS being played wrong.
Right.
I'm not an expert on that, but just that experience of that thought. If I was using any kind of damage reduction system, I didn't want it to be a fixed number.
Right.
For that reason. Because I wanted Eldritch to be designed where you could pretty much succeed at anything, even by chance. Even the challenges, instead of target numbers, it's randomly determined ranges of dice. So you always pretty much have a chance. And so if someone's potential harm attack gets through the active, then you have a die that's representing armor. So it could be a leather armor's D6, you roll a D6. If you had 16 points coming towards you, roll that D6. You roll the maximum value, you've absorbed all the harm without it getting to your passive, which is your physical ability to withstand the damage. So now you know this person is fatigued, out of the active defense, armor not necessarily damaged, but that's what I mean by narrative. That person can withdraw from the combat and try and revive some of that active defense, which does refresh 100% after the danger is over. Sort of like, your action heroes in that.
Sure.
But it's not that they're rolling a separate defense thing, and that's often misunderstood. That's actually like Palladium, where they're taking their dice and rolling oppositional rolls. it's not an opposed roll. It's just one roll of the dice, and they deal with the results.
I see. Okay. No, I like that. That actually makes sense. What are some of the more, well, hang on, because Rob, I know you had started this question off, and I'm not sure if we really touched on the core of what you were asking. Did we?
Well, it was, I mean, just talking about where some of the design decisions came from, what influenced them.
Okay.
You know, just talking about some of the decisions that went into it.
Yeah, well, the semantic part is just like trying to make sure that when people are playing it, it's like the decisions to say potential harm versus to hit, you know, like that, to make it clear that that's what I'm after in those things. Or I was extremely selective in how I, you know, poured over a thesaurus to make sure I was using the right word and that kind of thing. And part of it's just sort of tongue-in-cheek semantic design, because
Right.
to an extent, all of it is. With any game, they'd be careful with the wording.
And
It's
what
not rules
about
light.
magic?
Magic, yes. It's not rules light, I would like to say. I think originally I wrote the game even for what I considered to be experienced players, because it had no classes, it had no spell lists. It was designed for those who liked to just build from scratch. Not quite like Fudge or Cortex, where it's like modular, but it was designed so that, like GURPS, you would just build whatever you wanted from scratch. But with Magic, that was inspired by like Mage the Ascension originally. I really loved how with spheres you could combine all these different effects together to creatively come up with whatever you wanted in the moment. And so the first edition of Eldritch was very much focused on the quick play narrative combat with a heavy dependence on GM fight and player imagination. So there were 6 effects, you know: protect, harm, restore, you know, kind of like Savage Worlds, just have like you have your generic bolt effect or whatever, but they were even more broadly based than that. But then some players' feedback was, well, okay, that's well and good, and that's kind of cool, but I really get intimidated by that amount of choice. And I would prefer to have spell lists. Thank you very much. So I thought, oh, okay, well, so in the revised, I came up with spell lists. And the improvisational system that was its basis is still there. And for me, that's important, because as a GM, I don't want the person running the game to be beholden to the minutia and nitty-gritty of all the details of every individual spell, or even in the case of classes, which are nothing more than packages. Because at its core, the Eldritch game is extremely customizable. And so, like, I have classes and spells and all these things. I even introduced, oh my god, levels, right? Like up to 5.
You compromised.
Like, not for, yeah, pretty much. So, yeah, that works for me, because I completely, lost my train of thought, and I will just recover by pretending that I knew what I was talking about.
No, it all made good sense. Yeah, so I did see, you know, there are, you got the magic system. It has a nice, robust list of spells, well described. You have, at least we're switching back and forth between mechanics and the game world, but in the game world, you have all the sort of core fantasy races. I do notice you have Dragonborn, essentially, which are called Draken, right? Which actually I prefer to Dragonborn as a name. I think that's pretty cool. And the artwork throughout the book is really, really good. You know, as I was scanning through it, it's really neat artwork.
Oh, I'd love to tell you about the artwork.
Please.
That's an important point to me, because one of the reasons that I needed to do the Kickstarter was to afford any artwork at all. Artwork is really expensive.
Really? I hadn't noticed.
I didn't think. Yeah, I mean, I know it's a huge shock to everyone. Oh, and the sky is blue during the day. So.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, I've seen it. I've witnessed it myself.
They don't get a lot of blue days up in Canada. It's mostly gray. So
Actually, right now in your crimson hell.
That's to the east and west of me.
Well, I'm grateful that is the case for you.
Yes,
then.
thank you.
I'm all the way down in Florida, where I endured a Cat 5 hurricane. Oh wait, no, I'm way off track now. What was I talking about?
artwork.
Squirrel.
The art.
How expensive art is.
John is asking.
Can you tell I have
actually,
ADD?
Is it Dean Spencer art? He's asking, John.
Yes, it is, and that's a very important point to me, because when my first and then second attempt to get the second edition off the ground, and mind you, part of this was because I was trying to pay myself for the time and work that would be involved, but it was too much.
Yeah.
So, aim high, learn your lesson. But then I thought, well, how am I going to, I want to do it anyway. I'm going to do it anyway. Right? Because that's always what I've done. I just do it anyway.
Yeah.
And I thought, but how? Well, then I saw Gene Spencer's Patreon. And I thought, wow, he's really fantastic. This guy is really talented. And then I looked at Drive-Thru RPG and I thought, he's really talented and everyone knows it because everyone uses his art.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, if I'm going to try and stand out as something unique and have a unique product, then how can I use someone's art that is basically community art in that
Right.
sense? If they're
Very recognized.
And I thought, well, on the other hand, the core rules of Eldritch are generic fantasy. So it's perfect. And then I thought, and who am I going to find better? It was captivating art. I thought, you know what? Heck with it. I don't care if I'm judged for that. Like, if I know I had friends that like, oh, well, this new revision book of D&D had recycled art and that's deplorable or whatever. It's like, well, it's not recycled. You're supporting an artist. And especially these days, if I can support an artist, I feel really good about it because
Right.
What we know about Midjourney and that kind of stuff.
Right.
So even more pleased to do that. But I just ponied that up, month after month for the entire year after my last Kickstarter failed until I had something that looked good to present to my last attempt, which worked. And so for me, it was a win-win because, his art was perfect for my project. And I kind of feel good about it being that it's something that's used by the community of creators right now. It's just like, it's sort of an insular industry anyway.
Right.
I love
So
that
yeah,
one.
I know. This is
It
one
was
of my
a-
favorites.
it was a feel good thing for me. Yeah. And I actually gave him a copy. I have a free player's handbook on Drive-Thru, but I made an edition of it, it's the same thing basically. I'm still iterating on it, but I put Dean Spencer special edition and just had him send it out to his patrons because he should be proud of what he does.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing.
And you not only have it on Drive-Thru, so let me pull this up so people can see it. Hang on here, let me switch screens. So this is his link tree, and am I pronouncing it correctly? It's Polyphony, is that right?
Yes, you got that right.
Okay. So, this is the core site, polyphony.com. This has links on the link. I mean, tons of stuff out here. All the links to the Kickstarter. He's got music page, very sort of interesting, what would be the term for it? Sort of like cyber pop, I guess it would be. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sort of, Depeche Mode, Assemblage 23, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
I was inspired by that.
Whoa, thank you so much, Kurt. And I know you're going to be back soon. We've missed you. I hope you had a great vacation. You got the Eldritch page, your YouTube page. That's Crossroads, where all the music is at. Jordanheim, which we didn't even talk about tonight. Black Void, which we did. All here on, and then Alpha Rhythm, which also is music stuff. So really, really cool stuff. You can follow here. I'll pop the link tree in the chat so people can access it as well.
Oh, thanks.
There we go. So everybody that wants to check that out.
Yeah.
Vivian let her sub expire? What? Thank you for saving her, Rob. We're calling her out, one of the two. I'm not sure.
Thanks, Rob.
I got you.
Okay, so very cool. So I think I got us off track there a bit. Coming back to Eldritch RPG and looking at the mechanics of the game, what is it that, beside the combat, and I think you've got a very innovative, I was showing the character sheet earlier, very interesting character sheet system. What do you personally really like about the mechanics of the game that you've designed? Like, where do you think it's really added value to the game?
One, for the particular style that I prefer, it's perfect for me, and hopefully there'll be enough players that agree that that kind of approach is fun. But what I'm really proud of is that it is so easy to once understood, because I don't claim that it's a rules light system. It's not. And most people, they think of a narrative system, or that usually goes hand in hand with being a rules light system. But anyone that reads it would see that no, really, it's not. It's detailed. But at its core, just like with the magic system, even though you have like over 300 spells in there, it's like you can, as a GM, just know the 6 effects and put together whatever you want in the moment, on the spur of the moment, because everything is based off of those. And at the same time, like monsters, like you could, in the system, just because of how it was built from the beginning, to be like, well, one die represents one creature with its potential harm equaling and also being its hit points at the maximum value of the die. You could just have a fistful of dice thrown on the table, and those are your creatures. Minor is 1 die, the standard creature is 2, so it increases the bell curve on their attacks, and an exceptional creature is 3 dice. So you don't even need to write anything down for that. Mm-hmm. You can just throw the dice down, and I like that. I like being able to improvise so quickly. I have more complex formulations for that, and free spreadsheets you can use to put together creatures that have more attention to detail with their size or nature and things like that. But at its base, it's just simple.
Yeah, I like that. So I've got a couple other questions I want to ask you here, but let me just pause and see again. Robert, Vivi, anything else you wanted to follow up on this? And chat, if you have any other questions on this before we move on to our final couple comments and thoughts here, let us know, and we're happy to ask. So glad, Daniel, so much. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we've really enjoyed the conversation. Fascinating what you've done, and also the stories that you have. We're really grateful to you. Robert, Vivi, anything you want to ask or add?
Well, I mean, I guess the question I have is that, based on all the chatter that goes on between John's sessions and his campaigns, how do characters advance?
How do characters advance?
Yes.
Is it the character points, CP?
Yeah, it's character points. And I used to have a GM. When you were doing something good during the game, like in play game, he would do character points. He would say, 2-5. He would say 2-5. You get your character points for playing a character, or for actually doing something that was not necessarily for your own benefit, but it was consistent. That sort of thing. So the character points could be doled out during the game. And I have it structured where if you played every week and you got the number of character points that would be typical, that you would get to 5th level, which is like this game equivalent of 20th level in D&D, by 1 year of play. So it's kind of structured like that. But the only thing that's really tied to level in this is the amount of character points that you have, which is tiered, the 5 tiers. But also you get what they call a master, what I call they. I'm they. a mastery die. And so the system has a base attribute, a specialization or specialty, and then a focus bonus, which is +1 to +5. With the mastery die, you can add a 3rd die, so you're rolling the 3 dice plus the bonus. And that is tied to level. So level 1 is a D4. You can use it so many times per day in different situations, sort of like, Joss or inspiration or something like that.
Right.
And at 5th level, it's a D12. You can, again, use it so many times per day or during the session. So they advance with character points. They can build up their abilities. But when you increase the level, you don't automatically get, like, you buy what you want. So there's the customization.
Right.
In that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Pretty cool. Any follow-ups on that, Rob?
No.
Okay. Vivi, anything you want to ask? Okay.
Not offhand. Nope.
So a couple questions I had for you, Dan, is what comes next for you in terms of what you're designing, working on? I'm assuming you have another project either in the hopper or at least waiting in the wings, ruminating. What do you want to work on next? Whether it's for Eldritch RPG in terms of expansions or adventures or whatever it may be.
Well, first I want to update everything I've had to the 2nd edition. A lot of it, since the way the creatures are built and stuff, that really hasn't changed much. Just mostly the player stuff that changed. So that won't be too hard. So when I get that all updated and out. but then I'm actually sitting on a full license for Savage Worlds version of the world of the campaign setting. So I wanted, Eldritch being the system closest to my heart, I still wanted to bring it to a wider audience. So my next project, probably next year, would be to try to bring that out, to see how the Savage Worlds fans might like it, because that's, of systems out there other than Cortex, is probably the closest one to Eldritch that would easily convert. And that's why, again, I wouldn't choose to convert Eldritch to D&D or 5th edition, because I love 5th edition. I actually still play. I run it sometimes, but it just doesn't translate very well in my head.
Right.
So that's another project that I got going. Then the universe on Arave, there's something about the name Eldritch that I thought, well, there's, that brings up Lovecraftian thought. That brings up images of Cthulhu, right? So I thought, and that's really kind of missing from, there's a little bit of dark fantasy elements in the way things are described in the book and the setting. But I thought, well, I want to have a multi-genre game, and that's what Polyphony is going to be, actually, as the underlying system. And so the next project I wanted to do was like an Eldritch Earth, which is more modern day. And it's still the same concept where the dreams of mankind manifest in Anarave. But those settled lands are based on modern times. And when people travel through Anarave, it's based on the concept and what they know. So it's unlikely for them to travel to the fantasy realm. So these are distinct places typically. And I wanted to have that world focused on like investigators and have that kind of feel of the Call of Cthulhu kind of thing and the occult investigators. I thought that would be really cool to sort of slowly discover Anarave that way. And that would necessitate, doing another book with different focuses on how the skills are applied and that kind of thing. But yeah, so then a far fantasy would be my next one. And in all three, there would be the central figure of the Eldritch Man who takes on different personas, almost like a triple-headed god, influencing in certain subtle ways throughout, so that there's a common theme and a common cosmology, but completely different genres.
I love it. On the sort of the practical point, I note, and I haven't downloaded it yet and looked at it, but you have a phone app that appears to be will serve both your player and your DM. What exactly is the functionality that you have on your Eldritch RPG app?
Oh, okay. That was a stretch goal. That was needing about $6,000 to be reached, and that wasn't reached. However,
so you were only $1,000 away, right?
Yeah, but the campaign's over, so
late backers.
Yes. Yeah. Too bad. The margins are so thin anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe that was. But I decided, well, I'm just going to do it anyway. So I don't know how to program worth a damn, but I did discover that AI would have maybe a clue, but not that good. I don't think anyone's out of their job yet, because it kept making mistakes, and I spent an inordinate amount of time putting up JavaScript, not character generator yet, but encounter and monster generators on my website, based on JavaScript that AI helped me to write. But when it would mess up and get it wrong, I would take something from ChatGPT and feed it into Bard and say, what did it do wrong? And Bard would say, it did this wrong. And then I'd bring it back to ChatGPT and say, well, Bard said you messed this up.
Bard was terrible. I tried using Bard for that. I could not write anything in Bard. I have successfully written a Java and a Python script that I run through ChatGPT, but you're right. You have to know how to run the system. You have to watch for errors, and you have to iterate. With that said, I'm not a coder, and I was able to write a couple hundred lines of functioning Python code. But yeah, it's an arduous task, to be sure. But so you don't have the phone app yet.
Well, I don't see how. I had one person that was a Microsoft developer that was interested in Eldritch in general, but without that stretch goal having been met, and knowing that time goes on, and that to try and have someone develop something for iOS and Android,
right?
Without having that money up front, that in particular is probably not likely, which is why I started to try and beat ChatGPT into submission to something on my website. But that's just personal preference. I love digital tools.
Yeah.
And I was hoping for that.
Yeah. Were you, by the way, just as an aside, and I want to follow up with, I want to ask you about your DMing, and I know you do some paid DMing as well. Were you using 4.0 or 3.5 when you were doing that? Of GPT? Of GPT?
Oh, both.
Yeah, because 3.5 is terrible for that.
Yes.
Yeah, it is awful for that. All right, so talk to us about DMing, and really I have two questions. You're a paid DM. There's a website for that. I've seen it before. I forget the name of it. Maybe tell us about where we can find you on there and what you do. And then I want to close with the same sort of question I asked you about Gary. What kind of DM are you? So first tell about the paid DM, how you find it, and then how would you describe yourself as a DM?
Well, the site you're talking about is Let's Play Games.
Right, that's the one.
And I had considered being a paid DM because there's because if you watch this series by Alpha Stream, I think Teos Abadia from Eldritch Loremaster, like Eldritch podcast, it's nothing to do with my game, but or Mastering Dungeons. There's on Alpha Stream. There's a whole series about success in RPGs, and it occurred to me maybe I would make more money just running games. However, no one took me up on it. Like, it was just there, and I didn't really advertise or push for it. And I thought, well, no real loss. I occasionally, and very occasionally, get a chance to actually run anything online for some of my closest friends who have been playtesters in the past.
Right.
And so I haven't really gone back to that or focused. So I'm not a paid DM. I contemplated being one, and I do have a profile on that. So if anyone should, message me through that, I was like, oh, yeah, same name.
Is that in your link tree?
I don't think so, because I really didn't put any emphasis on it. It was something I thought, set it up, and then it's kind of like the naive way of thinking you'll do something well is to think they'll just come to your door.
That doesn't work, does it? No.
No, but I wasn't taking that too seriously. I mean, I take GMing very seriously as far as like its entertainment value, but and I didn't really worry about that too much. So if anyone comes knocking, I'll certainly answer the door.
Fair enough. And how would you describe yourself as a DM? And don't be modest. What are you good at? Like, what if I'm a player? What could I look forward to in your game?
You can look forward to things moving quickly along without getting bored. I'm pretty good at beats and keeping the action moving and making sure that player agency is important. And that's one of the reasons I do prefer smaller groups, because I like to switch the action frames a lot. Make sure everybody gets their limelight, and I love like Sly Flourish's advice, Mike Shea and Lazy DM, that kind of stuff. I really like his steps to prep, and I think that if I could describe my preparations, it would be pretty much as he would describe or advise. I used to do almost exclusively improvisation. I would just make things up and write down the notes as it occurred, just so I didn't later contradict myself.
Right.
So on the fly, I'm pretty good on my feet with that sort of thing. The only other thing is that, I mean, I've been told I'm one of the best DMs anyone's had, but I don't know that they've played with many other people, so I'm just grateful that they have a good time, for sure. And I'm not immune to what was it? I think I was listening to one of those podcasts recently where they were like, I have this panic before I run a game. Like, I have to have a contingency plan. If you get to it and you feel like this pressure or a sense of obligation to play, it's like you have to have a backup plan. Nope, movie.
Love it. Good advice. And yeah, very, very similar. We have different styles of play. Like Rob is almost, he does a lot of improv, a lot of sandbox stuff. And Rob, you well, I mean, I don't want to describe your style for you. You can kind of, why don't you share with Daniel and the crew kind of how you DM?
I mean, yeah, that's pretty much the major things. Like, I do a lot of improv because I'm a sandbox DM. I like letting the players and their characters figure out where they want to go next. Occasionally for the purpose of the story, I might force the action here and there, but I leave it in their hands. I want them to have that feeling that they're driving the adventure, and they're deciding the time and place where they're going to engage, and whatever the threat may be.
Yeah, I like that, and I guess that one of the questions that came up, and we'll wrap up here and right into Jay, but pacing is always a challenge, and I think pacing is so critical as a DM. where I find one of the biggest challenges that even as someone who's DM now for 40 years is that player agency and giving them the freedom then also sometimes can lead to a pacing challenge. And if they know there's a puzzle ahead, or they know there's a danger ahead, or they just want to have an extended role play moment, I am loath to introduce overmuch some sort of spur. I might give some warnings or some hints, but I really like to let them resonate and marinate in those role play moments. Or if they want to spend 15 minutes strategizing on how they're going to try to get around this trap, I try not to push
30 minutes over crossing.
Yeah, over crossing a bridge. Yeah, I try not to overly prod them along. How do you manage that in your games, Dan?
Pretty much just like you described.
Okay.
If they're having a moment, who am I to interrupt? I love to watch that kind of interaction, especially if they're trying to come up with a plan or whatever. And I don't, like, for example, I ran one thing for my family recently, and they just spent the whole time in a tavern. It's like I could tell that's just what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I had all kinds of stuff prepared, but I was like, no, they're really enjoying themselves. I'm not gonna blow up the tavern to get them out of it.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
Agreed. And I think everyone kind of knows my style. It depends. If you're running a one shot, that's going to be typically more structured, and it's going to have some push and some pacing. But I really like creating large ecosystems with multiple branches and then multiple meta narratives. And yes, the players can they can choose. They can tiers of Aird right now. I've got something like 225, 240 NPCs active in a city. The players have so many different arcs, but there will be central themes that push them along, and they have agency in all of that. So I like having that sort of a world. There's still tons of improv. There's still, they do things, of course, as players all the time. As a DM, you have no expectation of them doing, and then you follow that thread, and many times that's the best game that you have. But also then having that, I guess I would think of it as a lattice work of structure, makes me feel like I can do things like foreshadowing in a way that I'm not catching up to later, tying threads together in a tapestry where the players really have those aha moments. You can still do that with a complete sandbox style, but I find, at least for me, it's easier to do that when you have some measure of planning and then you incorporate the player agency. What about you, Vivi? How would you describe yourself as a DM?
I'm a lax DM. I mean, like I said, as long as everybody's having fun, I really don't care. That's the whole point. And I almost encourage tomfoolery sometimes because it's just really fun.
Yeah. Well, tomfoolery should always be in D&D. Absolutely.
Always.
She of the melons.
Yes.
Even in Sandbox, though, my theory is, give the players agency, but the bad guys have their own plans.
Yep, absolutely.
And they're gonna execute their own plans. I mean, my players, they know they can engage now or they can engage later, and sometimes you want to get to them before those plans are truly in motion.
Exactly. Well said. Well said. All right. Well, we're going to wrap up here, Dan. I'm going to give you the last word. Anything else that you would like to say to the audience? Audience, thank you, chat, for all the questions and all the comments. Alex, thank you again for, yes, exactly, they lurking in some corner. Any final thoughts you have for us, Dan? Yeah, and tell us how we can. I'm sorry. And also tell us how we can support you. Like, where should we go follow? What kind of things can our crew do, and people that will watch this on the VOD do to engage and to be of help to you?
Yeah. I like to hear from people. I like to talk to people. So I do have a Discord. If anybody wants to join that, there's not a whole lot of activity right now. I'm a small fish in a big pond. And I, more than anything, I just enjoy playing and engaging with people. So that's appreciated. If you go to polyphony.com, you can check out what's new. And I do have a Crossroads Games site on drive-thru-RPG.
Outstanding. Well, as always, Rob and Vivi, thank you so much for joining tonight. I really do want to catch up also, and I haven't watched yet the character and story arc VODs. I just haven't had time, but I will. But I'm sure they were a blast. And
I can watch those.
Yeah. And then also we have next week we have June Solar. June Solar is He runs much of the Dark Sun community, very engaged in Athos.org and the Dark Sun Discord. Dark Sun. So my core games right now are being running Greyhawk, which you see the box set above me here, and
Yes.
in Dark Sun as well, which is one of my favorite game settings. And so that'll be a fun chat next week. But thank you, Rob. Thank you, Vivi. And Dan, again, thank you for joining us. It was a blast. We're going to raid into Lord Gazumba. Reminder, on Friday night, we will have Rob and Friday Night Crusade, your castle keeper. All you have to do is pop in our Discord. No preparation necessary. If you can get with him in Discord, he can help you in just a few minutes. You can have a character. It's a Castles and Crusades Troll Lord Games, which is a rules light system, and
Yes, excellent.
he can get you up and running in the Discord. Hey, you should join us, Dan. You just pop in that Discord channel, and on Friday nights they run for about 3 hours, and it's a super fun crew. It's all voice chat. Robert, I think sometimes will turn on camera and show things, but most of them are all in voice chat. Then on Sunday, we'll have Tears of Aird, which will follow Aird Knights of the Rose on Troll Lord's channel. And then we'll be running our Aird game, the Tears of Aird, with our in-room crew. Amazing crew. That game has been so much fun. It's taking place in the free city of Altamira, which is Jay's city. And there's a box set coming out next year for Aird. So Lord Gazumba and Troll Lord Games collaborating on that. And we're actually helping produce content with our game that will be in that box set. So that's super fun. So they'll raid into us, we'll run our game, and then immediately following Tears of Aird, you'll have Fall of Red Dawn. And of course, they're having a great time in Cirque Fortuna, and that's been super active in our Discord. So all kinds of fun stuff happening. And with that said, thank you, Mad Chatters. Thank you again, Dan. And Rating J, Blue Box out.
Bye.
And